Stop this wedding immediately! He's already married, and you are both under arrest!
Picture this. A perfect summer afternoon. White roses swaying in the breeze, guests dressed in their finest, champagne glasses catching the golden sunlight. A wedding day, the happiest day of two people's lives. But in one explosive moment, it all shattered. A white woman stormed through the ceremony, phone pressed to her ear, screaming that these people were trespassing, demanding the police remove them immediately. The bride froze mid-vow, tears streaming down her face, not from joy, but from humiliation. The groom, a man who'd spent his entire life serving his community, stood there powerless as his own wedding became a crime scene in the eyes of a stranger who saw nothing but the color of his skin. And when those patrol cars pulled up, sirens wailing, everything changed. Because what that woman didn't know, what she couldn't have possibly known, would turn her world upside down in seconds.
Marcus Thompson had always believed in service. At 42 years old, he dedicated 20 years to his community, first as a city councilman, then as the youngest mayor Riverside Hills had ever elected. He wasn't just a politician, he was a son of this town, born in the neighborhood everyone else had abandoned, raised by a single mother who cleaned houses to keep him in school. He knew every street corner, every struggling family, every kid who needed a mentor. He'd built basketball courts in forgotten neighborhoods, funded after-school programs, and sat at kitchen tables with elderly residents who couldn't pay their heating bills. To Marcus, being mayor wasn't about power. It was about payback to the place that made him. And now, after years of late nights and lonely dinners, he'd found someone who understood that calling. Dr. Simone Carter was a trauma surgeon at Riverside General, a woman whose hands saved lives every single day. She'd grown up 3 states away, but had chosen this community because she, too, believed in being where she was needed most. When Marcus met her at a hospital fundraiser 2 years ago, he knew immediately she was home. Their love story was quiet but profound. Early morning runs before dawn, strategy sessions over takeout Chinese food at midnight, Simone understanding when Marcus had to cancel dates for emergency council meetings, Marcus showing up at the hospital with coffee during her double shifts. They were partners in every sense, 2 people determined to make the world less broken, one decision at a time. So when Marcus proposed under the old oak tree in Riverside Park, the same tree where his mother used to take him as a child, Simone didn't hesitate. They decided on an intimate ceremony at the estate they'd just purchased together, a beautiful historic property with sprawling gardens, the kind of place where both their families could celebrate without pretense or formality. 60 guests, close friends, family, colleagues. Simple and meaningful, exactly who they were. The property backed up to one of the wealthiest neighborhoods in the county, but Marcus and Simone hadn't thought twice about it. They'd followed every regulation, obtained every permit, sent courtesy notices to every neighbor within 5 blocks. This was their home now, their future, the place where they'd build their family. What they didn't know was that one neighbor had been watching since the day they moved in, watching through binoculars, making notes, building resentment. Because to Carol Hendricks, a 56-year-old real estate agent who'd lived in her pristine colonial for 30 years, Marcus and Simone weren't neighbors. They were a threat, an invasion, a disruption to the character of the neighborhood she'd worked so hard to maintain. Code words she'd learned to use in polite company, masking what she really meant, but was too careful to say out loud. Carol had made phone calls to the Homeowners Association, which didn't govern Marcus's property, to the zoning board, which confirmed everything was legal, 2 other neighbors, most of whom declined to share her concerns. But Carol wasn't deterred. She'd been documenting everything, the catering trucks, the tent installation, the string lights in the trees. In her mind, she was protecting property values, preserving standards, keeping things the way they'd always been. On the morning of the wedding, Marcus woke with the sun streaming through the bedroom window and Simone's hand in his. In 12 hours, she'd be his wife. He felt invincible, grateful, ready. He had no idea that across the property line, Carol Hendricks was already dressed, phone charged, waiting for her moment.
The ceremony was scheduled for 3 o'clock, and by 2:30, the garden had transformed into something magical. White roses climbed the arbor where Marcus and Simone would exchange vows. Round tables dotted the lawn, each with centerpieces of wildflowers Simone had personally chosen. A jazz quartet warmed up near the veranda, their music drifting through the afternoon air. Children ran between tables laughing. Marcus's mother dabbed at her eyes, unable to believe her son had come so far. Simone's father adjusted his tie for the 10th time, practicing his father of the bride speech in whispers. Marcus stood at the entrance to the garden in his charcoal gray tuxedo, greeting guests, shaking hands, accepting hugs. He felt lighter than he had in years. City council drama, budget fights, political pressure, none of it mattered today. Today was about love, about family, about beginning the next chapter with the woman who'd changed everything. At 2:50, the string quartet began the processional music. Guests stood. Marcus took his position under the arbor, his best man beside him, hands clasped, heart pounding. He watched the garden entrance, waiting for that first glimpse of Simone in her dress. That's when he heard the shouting. At first, it was distant, sharp but unclear, like someone arguing in a neighboring yard. Marcus frowned, glancing at his best man, who shrugged. The music continued. Guests shifted uncomfortably, some turning to look toward the commotion. Then she appeared. Carol Hendricks stormed through the garden entrance like an avenging angel, phone pressed to her ear, her cream suit immaculate, her blonde hair perfectly styled, her face twisted with fury. She marched straight down the aisle, the actual wedding aisle, pointing at Marcus, at the guests, at the decorations, her voice rising with every step. "Yes, I'm here now," she barked into the phone. "There are at least 60 people trespassing on private property. They've set up tents, they're playing loud music, they're completely out of control." Guests gasped. Someone said, "What is she doing?" Marcus's mother grabbed the arm of the person next to her, confusion and fear crossing her face. Children stopped running, sensing the sudden tension. Marcus stepped forward, hands raised in a calming gesture, his voice steady, despite the adrenaline flooding his system. "Ma'am, I think there's been a misunderstanding. This is a private event on private property. We have all the necessary permits. I don't care what you think you have. This is a residential neighborhood with rules, and you people think you can just show up and do whatever you want." You people. The words hung in the air like poison. The music stopped. 60 people stood frozen, watching this white woman, this stranger, reduce a wedding ceremony to a confrontation about belonging. Marcus felt his jaw tighten, but his voice remained calm, the voice he'd trained himself to use in hostile city council meetings, in budget hearings where opponents tried to bait him, in every professional space where his anger would be weaponized against him. "Ma'am, my name is Marcus Thompson. My fiancé and I own this property. We've notified all neighbors, obtained all the permits. I'd be happy to show you the documentation." "I don't need to see anything," Carol snapped, still on the phone with 911. "Yes, send officers immediately. The property is on Elmwood Drive. They're refusing to leave." Simone appeared at the garden entrance, resplendent in her ivory gown, her father beside her, both frozen in shock. Simone's hand flew to her mouth. "This couldn't be happening. Not today. Not now." Marcus saw her, saw the devastation in her eyes, and something inside him cracked. But he couldn't break. Not here. Not in front of his mother, his community, the children watching. So he did what he'd always done. He kept his composure, even as his heart shattered.
"Everyone, please remain calm," Marcus said, turning to his guests, his voice projecting over the chaos. "This is a misunderstanding. We'll resolve it quickly." But Carol wasn't finished. She marched to the center of the garden, addressing the crowd like a prosecutor delivering closing arguments. "This neighborhood has standards. We have regulations about noise, about gatherings, about maintaining property values. And now you people think you can just move in and disrespect everything we've built." "We live here," Simone's voice cut through the garden, raw with emotion. She walked down the aisle in her wedding dress, her father trying to hold her back, but she pulled free. "This is our home. We sent you a notice. We followed every rule." Carol looked Simone up and down with barely concealed contempt. "I received no such notice. And frankly, I don't believe a word you're saying." The accusation, the automatic assumption of dishonesty, hit like a physical blow. Several guests began recording on their phones. Marcus's best man muttered a curse under his breath. An older woman in the front row began crying. Marcus moved to stand beside Simone, taking her hand. His voice was quiet but firm. "Ma'am, you're disrupting a private ceremony on private property. I'm asking you politely to leave." "I'm disrupting?" Carol's laugh was sharp, mocking. "You're the ones who don't belong here." And there it was, the truth beneath the complaints about permits and noise and property values. You don't belong here. Not in this neighborhood, not in this tax bracket, not in this space that people like Carol had spent decades keeping people like Marcus and Simone out of. In the distance, sirens wailed. Carol smiled, victorious. "Finally, let's see what the police have to say about all this." Marcus felt Simone's hand trembling in his. He squeezed it, trying to communicate everything he couldn't say out loud. "I'm sorry. This isn't your fault. I love you. We'll get through this." But inside, a familiar despair was rising. The despair of a man who'd spent his entire life proving himself, achieving, serving, only to be reduced to a trespasser at his own wedding day by a woman who knew nothing about him except the color of his skin.
The lead officer was in his mid-30s, stocky, with a no-nonsense expression that gave nothing away. His partner was younger, lankier, eyes darting nervously between Carol and the crowd of well-dressed wedding guests. Carol descended on them immediately, her voice shrill with righteous indignation. "Thank God you're here. These people are having an unauthorized gathering on this property. I've lived here for 30 years, and I know for a fact they don't have permission to be here. They're trespassing, disturbing the peace." The lead officer held up a hand, cutting her off. "Ma'am, slow down. Whose property is this?" "It's private property, and they have no right—" "I asked whose property this is." The officer repeated, his tone patient but firm. He turned to Marcus. "Sir, do you own this property?" Marcus stepped forward, his hand still holding Simone's, his voice steady despite the humiliation burning in his chest. "Yes, officer. My name's Marcus Thompson. My fiancée, Dr. Simone Carter, and I purchased this property 4 months ago. This is our wedding ceremony. We have all the necessary permits for the event, and we sent courtesy notifications to all neighbors within the required radius." The officer's eyes narrowed slightly, not with suspicion, but with recognition. He glanced at his partner, who'd gone very still. "Marcus Thompson? As in Mayor Thompson?" The world seemed to stop. Carol's face drained of color. Several guests gasped. Phones that had been recording now captured the moment in high definition. "Yes, sir," Marcus said quietly. The younger officer muttered something under his breath that sounded like, "Oh shit." The lead officer's jaw tightened. He turned slowly to Carol, whose expression had shifted from triumphant to horrified, her mind clearly racing through implications, consequences, the sudden reversal of power. "Ma'am," the officer said, his voice taking on a careful, measured tone,
Are you aware that you just disrupted Mayor Thompson's wedding and falsely reported a crime? Carol's mouth opened and closed, no sound emerging. Her hands fluttered uselessly. I didn't... How was I supposed to know? You weren't supposed to know. Simone's voice cut through the garden like a blade, raw with fury and pain. You were supposed to respect that we live here. You were supposed to read the notice we sent you. You were supposed to treat us like human beings instead of criminals. The lead officer looked at Marcus with something that might have been apology or embarrassment or recognition of an injustice he couldn't undo. Mayor Thompson, I apologize for this disruption. Do you want to press charges for filing a false police report and trespassing on your property during a private event? Marcus looked at Carol, this woman who'd tried to destroy his wedding day, who'd humiliated his bride, terrified his mother, traumatized the children present, all because she couldn't accept that he belonged in a space she'd claimed as her own. He thought about his years in public service, the philosophy his mother had taught him about taking the high road, about being bigger than the hate directed at you. But he also thought about Simone's tears, about the moments stolen from them, about every black person who'd ever been questioned, challenged, forced to prove their right to exist in spaces they'd earned, paid for, and deserved. Carol Hendricks, Marcus said, his voice carrying across the silent garden. You saw preparations for a wedding and assumed it was a crime. You saw a black couple and their guests and decided we must be trespassing. You didn't ask questions. You didn't check facts. You weaponized the police against us on the day we were supposed to be celebrating our future. Carol's face crumpled. I'm so sorry. I didn't mean... You meant exactly what you did, Simone said, her voice breaking. And now 60 people, including children, watched me walk down the aisle to police sirens instead of music because you decided we didn't belong here. The lead officer shifted uncomfortably. Ma'am, we're going to need you to leave this property immediately. Mayor Thompson has the option to press charges. I'm not pressing charges, Marcus said quietly. Every guest turned to him in surprise. Simone squeezed his hand, supporting whatever decision he made. Marcus looked at Carol, whose makeup was now streaked with tears. But I want you to understand something. This isn't about permits or noise ordinances or property values. This is about the fact that you looked at me and my fiancé and saw criminals instead of neighbors. And that's going to be your burden to carry, not mine. The officers escorted Carol off the property, her cream suit disappearing down the driveway, her sobs audible long after she was out of sight. The sirens fell silent. The patrol cars pulled away. Marcus turned to face his guests, his family, his friends, his community, all of them still standing, still watching, still processing what they'd witnessed. Well, he said, his voice cracking slightly. That was unexpected. Nervous laughter rippled through the crowd. Then someone started clapping, then someone else. Within seconds, the entire garden erupted in applause. Not polite, ceremonial applause, but thunderous, defiant, solidarity-filled applause that said, "We see you. We're with you. You belong here."
The wedding continued. The string quartet resumed playing. Simone walked down the aisle again, and this time there were no interruptions. Just tears, joy, and the overwhelming relief of reclaiming a moment that had nearly been stolen. When Marcus said "I do," his voice shook with emotion that went far beyond typical wedding nerves. When Simone kissed him, the crowd roared. But something had shifted. As the reception unfolded, as guests ate and danced and toasted the newlyweds, the conversation kept circling back to what had happened. Parents tried to explain to confused children why that woman had been so angry. Older guests shared their own stories of being questioned in spaces they had every right to occupy. Younger guests posted on social media, and within hours the story was spreading beyond the garden, beyond Riverside Hills, becoming another data point in the ongoing documentation of everyday racism. Marcus and Simone danced their first dance as husband and wife to John Legend's All of Me. But midway through, Simone whispered, "I keep thinking about the kids who saw that. About your mom's face." "I know," Marcus whispered back, holding her closer. "Me too." Later, as the evening wound down and guests departed, with hugs and well wishes that felt heavier than usual, Marcus's mother pulled him aside. Her eyes were still red from crying, but her voice was steady. "Baby, I am so proud of how you handled that, but I am so angry that you had to." Marcus hugged her tightly. "I know, Mama. Me too." The story didn't end that night. By Monday morning, local news outlets had picked it up. By Tuesday, it was national news. Carol Hendricks issued a public apology that felt more about damage control than genuine remorse, resigned from the real estate agency where she worked, and moved out of her house within 2 months. The incident sparked renewed conversations about racial profiling, about weaponizing police against black people in everyday situations, about the exhausting reality of constantly having to prove you belong. But it also sparked something else. The video footage from guests' phones became a teaching tool in diversity trainings across the country. Marcus and Simone received hundreds of messages from other interracial couples, from black professionals, from people who'd experienced similar incidents and felt validated that someone with a platform was speaking their truth. Schools began discussing the incident in social studies classes, exploring questions about implicit bias, privilege, and allyship. Marcus returned to his mayoral duties with renewed purpose, proposing legislation that required implicit bias training for all city employees, establishing a task force on discriminatory policing, and creating a public database of racial profiling complaints. Simone joined the hospital's Diversity and Inclusion Committee, working to address the healthcare disparities she saw in the emergency room every day. Their marriage, forged in that moment of profound injustice, became unshakable, because they'd learned on day one that their love would constantly be tested by a world that wasn't ready for it, and they'd decided that they would meet that challenge together, every single time. Here's what Carol Hendricks didn't understand that day. Marcus Thompson didn't need to be the mayor for her actions to be wrong. Simone Carter didn't need to be a doctor for them to deserve respect. They didn't need permits or credentials or achievements to justify existing in a space they'd purchased with their own money. Their humanity should have been enough. The fact that it wasn't, that Carol needed police sirens and badges and the revelation of Marcus's title to realize she'd made a mistake, reveals everything about how racism operates in America today. Because this wasn't about rules or noise or property values. It was about power. It was about who gets to occupy certain spaces without question and who has to constantly prove they belong. It was about the subtle and not so subtle ways that black excellence is met with suspicion instead of celebration, criminalized instead of honored. And the most devastating part? This happens every single day. Maybe not at weddings, but in coffee shops where black customers are asked to leave, in neighborhoods where black residents are questioned by police because someone assumes they're out of place, in workplaces where black professionals are mistaken for janitors or assistants instead of executives. The names change, the locations change, but the story remains heartbreakingly familiar. So here's the question we all need to ask ourselves. What would you have done if you were a guest at that wedding? Would you have recorded? Would you have confronted Carol? Would you have stood in silent solidarity or looked away in discomfort? And more importantly, what will you do the next time you witness someone being treated as though they don't belong simply because of how they look? Because change doesn't happen when we watch these stories unfold on screens and feel momentarily outraged before scrolling to the next thing. Change happens when we recognize these moments in real time in our own communities and choose to act, to speak up, to stand with, to make it clear that this isn't acceptable. Not at weddings, not in neighborhoods, not anywhere. Marcus and Simone Thompson are still married. They're still serving their community. They've turned their wedding day trauma into a catalyst for meaningful change. But they shouldn't have to. No one should. If this story moved you, don't just hit like and move on. Share it. Talk about it. Let it be a conversation starter at your dinner table, in your workplace, in your friend groups. Because stories like this need to be heard. Not just to document the injustice, but to challenge all of us to be better, to do better, to build a world where someone's wedding day isn't interrupted by sirens, but only by joy. Drop a comment below. Have you ever witnessed or experienced something like this? How did you respond? Let's keep this conversation going, because silence is how these injustices continue.